So I was talking to a friend the other day, and we're talking about values and politics, and we're kind of sussing each other out. And he sort of said, you know, like his values are quite libertarian, and I thought about it too. Like my intuitions, you know, as a Celtic / Anglo British descended middle class white guy, you know, my intuition's still very libertarian, but I described my position as like an evolved libertarian. And I think it's a good way to phrase sort of the transition from traditional libertarian to propertarianism. So libertarians, you know, like they're market focused, and what always happens with these ideologies is people fill in the gaps, or they superimpose their intuitions onto ideologies, and they kind of change them a little bit to suit themselves. And so, like in the same way that you might say, well, we need to have equality under the law, then the feminine left, who have the maternal instincts of looking after children and herd morality and all that sort of stuff, they will morph equality under the law, they will morph that into equality of outcome or all sorts of equality that they're expecting. But it's not really the same concept, but they morph an ideology or a philosophy to suit their incentives or to suit their intuitions. And so libertarians are a lot of people like me, you know, fairly intelligent, hardworking, ambitious, market ambitious people, like financially and career driven people who want to achieve. And I can say, after speaking to a lot of libertarians, like really a lot of it boils down into I don't want to be taxed so much, I want to be left alone to produce, and they want less redistribution, which currently, you know, you can see the demand for libertarianism as it really burst onto the scene, you know, within the last sort of 5 or 10 years. I'd never heard of it before in my life, and suddenly everyone was talking about being libertarian. Well, we're entering into this phase where redistribution of all forms of capital is at such ridiculous levels that it's actually dysgenic. And so no wonder an ideological response was libertarianism, which, you know, talking about taxation being theft. You know, I'm sure that if there wasn't such ridiculous demands for taxation, you know, where we can reasonably assume that we're probably paying about 50% of our working product, our working lives, probably paying 50% in taxes. So that is insane. But if we could realistically assume that we're paying probably, you know, a maximum total of 10 or 15% of our productivity towards the commons, so towards other people, then it might not be such a problem, and therefore probably wouldn't have generated such an ideological demand for libertarianism to create that mindfulness. So I think, just as a little side point, you know, Kurt always talks about mindfulness, and I think this is the reason why ideologies, like one of their functions anyway, is they pop up and they create mindfulness. And by mindfulness, I guess it just means making you mentally feel better, so that you have almost like a mental and emotional drug to get you through a current situation. You know, like when people are in tough times, they will turn to a religion or something, and it just lets them mentally and emotionally feel better and cope better with the situation they're in. It was actually very interesting that Kurt talked about the different levels of superstition in religions, with, you know, Japanese Shintoism and Buddhism being on if you looked at a scale from more woo-woo fantastical superstitions and supernaturalism on one end to less on the other, then you can actually see the amount of supernaturalism, the amount of fantastical supernaturalism in religions gets greater if you look at the more stressful a situation that those populations are in. So the Japanese, being very homogenous, they have homogenous, very civilized and calm and ordered society. They have a less demand for mindfulness. They have a less demand for a mental and emotional drug, almost, you could say, mental and emotional feeling better, and so their religion or their ideological structures have less of that fantastical supernaturalism, whereas you go all the way down to probably the most chaotic, the most anxiety-inducing, the most mentally and emotionally hard environments, being the Middle East. That's where you find more fictional supernaturalism in their religions, because there's a greater demand for mindfulness. There's that greater demand for feeling good and being able to cope with what's going on. Anyway, so in this modern time where redistribution of all forms of capital, not just financial, but all forms of capital, is absolutely at insane levels, it's probably no wonder that libertarianism became popular the last 10 years, because you've had this situation that creates that demand for a ideology that provides the opposite mindfulness. Anyway, that aside, so I was talking about being an evolved libertarian, and if you're going to look at libertarianism, I think once again it has a heavy element of projection by a certain type of person, male, market-driven, able to achieve in a market, being fairly meritorious yourself, having merit in the market yourself. And so if you project that onto other people, you kind of just go, well, why don't you all just why don't you all just compete in a market? Or it's kind of like saying, oh, you're poor, why don't you just stop being poor? Why don't you just create your own business? Why just start a business, bro? And you're like, yeah, but if you stop projecting onto other people, what do you actually do with people who can't do that, who can't compete in the market, who really don't have the merit to not be left behind or to be forever consigned to the bottom? And that's one of the things that reciprocity changes when you go from sort of looking at being, a meritocracy or this libertarian free market to actually going, well, if the organizing principle is reciprocity, then you need to create reciprocity with all these people's different demands, and you can't just project a society that you would prefer onto other people. And so what do you do with people who can't compete in markets? Well, you have to necessarily look after them, give them some status, because if they feel like they're falling off the bottom rungs of society, then they have no incentive to participate in that society, and then you're going to drive up crime. They're just going to say, well, society doesn't care about me, so I'm not going to care about society, because we will intuit that reciprocity. And so you want to stop that happening, because you actually don't want to create a whole bunch of people with an incentive to burn society down. It's kind of like that thing of, like, if you have that perfect meritocracy in dating, that's kind of where we've gotten with the breakdown of marriage. If you look at marriage is some kind of, well, it's a limit on human behavior, but it stops this natural thing of alphas and harems, and then leaving a whole bunch of men with no access to females on their own, and therefore having an incentive to burn everything down. And so it's the same kind of thing. Like, if you look at a pure meritocracy, say, a pure market solution of, well, bro, why don't you just get a six-pack? Well, bro, why don't you just be over 6 foot tall? Well, bro, why don't you just be born more attractive? Or whatever it is that the women are seeking. Or, bro, why don't you just be born into generational wealth? That's more the libertarian take. Well, bro, why don't you just X? But you can't. Not everybody can do everything. And so what do you do? And so say with the dating market, where you actually can't have a functioning society if 10% of the men are sleeping with 90% of the women. The women are happy to hang out with their friends, get redistribution from the working pleb class of men so that they can all be single mothers leeching off the government and raising the kids they have with alphas. Well, that breaks reciprocity. And I would say as a self-respecting man myself, I would clearly say my values are, rather than not have my own wife and have my own kids and just exist in a society where I'm paying 50% taxes just so a whole bunch of women can go have kids with a whole bunch of Chad alphas and then hang out with their, being single mothers, taking my productivity but not carrying my genes, that is definitely a society I would prefer to burn down. Unironically, that's not the case for me though, because I've never had a problem at the department, but it's just highlighting the point. So, but the analogy to that too is, well, not everyone can compete in the market successfully, and so if you don't have some kind of way of taking care of these people and making sure they get something, then you're just creating an incentive for them to burn down society yet again. So all these different places we look, it's like, let's try and not create a situation where people's incentive is to burn down society. That'd be great, because we don't want to burn down society. So like I said, I'm an evolved libertarianism, because the libertarians, a lot of them, and I've spoken to a lot of them, are like, just compete in the market, just compete, just do this, just do that. But for people, they can't. And so reciprocity, if you look under reciprocity, analyze it from the perspective of reciprocity. Well, some people have a need for redistribution, and there's nothing we can do about that, but the best we can do is redistribute to them to the point where they hopefully we minimize, to whatever degree we can afford, we minimize this feeling that they have of being an outcast of society, falling off the lower rungs and being left behind. But you say to people, if we give this to you, then you have to behave. You have to contribute to this society. Like, you have to contribute by minimizing as much as possible the bad things that you do. You have to contribute to this society by following the rules, by being law-abiding, by not having more kids and continually exporting greater and greater costs, therefore increasing the demand for more and more redistribution to you, because you keep having kids. So you need to say, we will look after you if you do the right thing. And that's an optimum solution, because people can't just compete in markets. But look, at the end of the day though, it is still a libertarian disposition, because in the true sense of the word, I think a true libertarian would say, well, look, there are actually a lot of ways to live, and I'm not going to impose that on you. But let's just try and separate so that we don't export the costs of how we want to live onto other people who don't want them. So, like I said, I think under proprietarianism, with reciprocity, people are different, our genetics are different, our group strategies are different, our intuitions are different. We have different demands for what society we want to live in. We have different IQs, all these sort of things. And the best we can hope to do is create reciprocity between all these differences. And, as far as I ever really understood it, that is really like a true libertarian thing. It's fine to do all these things, live and let live, but also not just live and let live, but also live and bear your own costs, and let other people live and bear their own costs as well. So when you have a whole bunch of these people who can't compete and are feeling like they're being left behind in society, they can earn that in a degree, in a way, by not doing bad things. Just don't do bad things. And so that was also what Kurtz talked about, the function of Christianity. A lot of people, especially in the lower classes, they are status sensitive, very sensitive to their relative status, and they get very, very unhappy and feel shit about life if the status between them and everyone else is too great a difference, if they feel like they're just too far down the bottom compared to everyone else. But this is the interesting thing about Christianity, is it said love one another and all that and everything, but you can have a certain degree of status by not breaking the law, by just being a good, responsible person. Now that's really gone by the wayside these days. But, you know, even when I was younger, I actually felt that, you know, even in my country, you know, you'd say, well, this guy, he's hardworking. He's hardworking. And that would get you a wife too. You didn't have to be anything fancy, but if you went to work and you didn't break the rules and you earned a decent living, and you just were a hardworking, decent member of society, that would get you status. That would get you respect, and that would get you a family. It would get you a woman and a family, and your woman would say, oh yeah, Jim, you know, he's hardworking. That's great. You know, this is another cultural thing that really seems to have gone by the wayside these days as well, where we've just unleashed so many different forces that, you know, and especially as Kurt talks about, we've unconstrained female hypergamy, and it feels a lot these days, even though I'm not in the dating market, it feels like a lot these days that you don't have status by running an honest, hardworking business or being an honest, hardworking guy these days. You have status if you make a ton of money, and that's the problem. Is, you know, Kurt was saying too that a lot of the problem with dating is that the lower middle or the upper lower class people, the people who want to work their way into the middle class or up the middle class from the lower middle class, especially the women, their hypergamy has been unleashed, and so they are not happy with men at their class. They're not happy with men at their class, and so now, and once again because of social media, it's like a young guy, you know, if your only experiences of women is porn stars and bikini models, you look at an average woman and go, she's not hot. Why don't I get a woman that looks like a bikini model? And you're like, well, you're not, it's not your thing, you know, you don't have the status to achieve and keep that. And, and therefore you're setting people up to be unhappy. Well, the same with, you know, all this like 50 Shades of Grey and all that stuff, you know, you've just got these average women, you know, in that 50 Shades of Grey, the lead female character, she's just an average chick, you know, she's not you know, she's definitely pretty. You have to be pretty enough to be in a movie, but especially they hand it up in the movie that she's just an average, awkward kind of bookie girl, and the status that used to be for millionaires is now billionaires, you know. It's not even a big deal to be a millionaire these days, it's billionaire. He's a billionaire playboy that's just obsessed with me, you know, all that stuff. And so, yeah, just that idea that libertarianism, in a way, propertarianism is libertarianism. It's just with a much more expanded idea of property, a much more expanded concept of what property is. So libertarians might be like, well, we need to trade. Like they're all about the free market, because at least they do realize that in the market we need to trade to create cooperation. We shouldn't run to the monopoly. We shouldn't create monopolies and use those monopolies to oppress each other. But if you expand that idea, that libertarian thinking, to all forms of property, and if you look at, you know, social norms and things like that, so the institutions of cultural production, what society you want to live in, if you look at that as a type of property, then you can still use that same thinking of like, well, I don't want to project onto you what I prefer. We need to trade between these. So, you know, libertarians, they are like halfway there in a sense. That so when it comes to the market, they can say, no, we need to have reciprocity, like voluntary exchange in a market. But propertarianism is, like I said, it's like an evolved libertarianism where you take that same thinking of we need voluntary exchange to all forms of property. We need reciprocity right across the board to accommodate everything from, yes, like markets to social norms, government demands, all these sort of things. You need to create that reciprocity. And that's where libertarians fall short, because, you know, one of the classic things was libertarians would be like, no, private property. We uphold private property to the point where they say taxation is theft. But then they would always say things like, well, why can't I bring in, say, foreign workers onto my property, even though you might be my neighbor and live in the same street? Why can't I bring people onto my private property to work for whatever rate I agree with? Well, because you're stealing another form of property. If you look at trust, social cohesion and trust, if you bring in people who have different demands on what's the sort of society and social norms they want to live under, then you are stealing from the common property, which is the societal trust or whatever social norms you've built up. You know, so they would say, you know, you can't come onto my property because you're stealing one form of property, but they're talking about, you know, money and physical property. But as an evolved libertarian, or, you know, propertarian, you know, you can see the limitations of formal libertarianism, because what they advocate a lot of the time is just theft of other forms of property. Theft of other forms of property. But look, the good thing is, though, I think that at the end of the day, one thing I did like about libertarianism was the live and let live mentality. The live and let live mentality of, why don't we just all compete and produce, and you do you and I'll do me. And I do like that about propertarianism and reciprocity across the board, because if you really go through that whole thought process, it is an evolution of that same instinct of like, look, I don't actually want to oppress you, but I want to force you to pay the costs of your own demands and your own choices. But of course, it's very, very hard when you have a whole political faction that says, well, but forcing me to pay my own costs is what I call oppression. That's a different conversation, and that's when the rule of law needs to come down, and there will be people who, under reciprocity, will be ruled against, and they will be very, very unhappy about it, and they will call it oppression, because what they're calling oppression is you pay your own costs. So that's another conversation. But at the end of the day, I do think it is a great system, because you can work out from that desire to see the best for everybody, and see it right across the board, and implement that reciprocity across the board, saying, look, it's not just I can't come onto your house, or I can't steal your physical property, or I can't tax your income. It's not just that. It's not just I can't thieve from you in those ways. It is, no, I can't come onto your property. I can't, take your income and just parasitize your income. But I also can't trespass against your social norms. I can't force you into a system of government that you don't want. I can't force you into social norms that you don't want. And if that's happening, then we need to separate. I hope those are some cool thoughts, but on transition from libertarian to propertarianism. But like I said, I was speaking to a mate the other day, and I did like that phrase of how I communicated that to him. Someone who already had a fair kind of like libertarian leaning said, well, look, I'm a libertarian as well ultimately, but I'm an evolved libertarian. I'm like an expanded libertarian, taking that same idea and fully accounting for all forms of property. Evolved libertarian. I think that was a cool phrase.